Started here. Okay, I'm going to warn the group ahead of time. I'm actually not at my house. I'm at a hotel this evening, and I'm praying that this internet connection holds. So if something wacky happens, blame the Hampton Inn blame the Hampton Inn. But so far I think we're okay. So, all right, let me get into my slideshow here. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to this evening's webinar. My name is Eleanor Rangers. I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving Cold War related history from the Southeastern PA area. Although we've started to offer these webinars back in 2012 to highlight some local Cold War related history, but over time we have expanded that remit to be able to encompass some broader Cold War related topics since we've taken them into the realm of the digital with webinars. And this is our History in Our Backyard webinar series. Just a reminder, I have changed out our email distribution system. If you are not receiving emails from me or they suddenly disappeared, check your junk mail folder, because it's possible that that may have switched with the switchover in the email system. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. If you know of anyone as well who's interested in attending these lectures, they do need to be added to my email distribution list. So if they could reach out to mail@coldwarhistory.org, we're happy to add them in to join the fun once a month. I did want to give a heads up. Apparently Amazon is going to be discontinuing their matching program for nonprofit contributions. So unfortunately, that's going to be going away. But certainly, if you're so inclined to donate to our organization, there are other ways to do that. We have a donate button on our website. So you certainly can donate that way, but I know for some people they were using Amazon Smile for that in the past, but I did want to let you know that unfortunately is going to be going away. As some of you may have heard, we were chatting a little bit about the display room that we're in the process of developing at the Fuge in Warminster, and hoping to get that up within the next couple of weeks. So we'll have to let you know once that's ready to view, and it will be highlighting history of the old Naval Air Development Center. So really looking forward to that debut fairly soon. Also, we do record these webinars. Many people, do email me and say, hey, I can't make that lecture that night, or hey, Thursday nights are not good for me. So we do, put these on our website for viewing afterwards. We also have a presence on Facebook. So if you are on Facebook, definitely look for us there, and we do post information there regularly as well. Also, for this presentation, other than the speaker, if you could mute your microphones and turn off your cameras, that will help to preserve bandwidth, particularly since maybe my connection is not so great this evening. Also wanted to let you know that we are on the back half of the year now for our lecture series that will be continuing through December. In July, we have John Ramirez returning actually to talk about American technical ops in the Shah's Iran. Interesting presentation. Of course, he was involved with signal ops with the CIA for a long time. So looking forward to John again on July 13th. And there's John again. All right, so without further ado, let's introduce our guest speaker this evening, Eddie Ide.
Good evening.
All right, Eddie, let me formally introduce you here. I understand that you are a historian, a board member, and former vice president of the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation. Eddie has a lifelong enthusiasm for aviation history. His interest in the Berlin Airlift began in 1993 when he was publicist at the Wilkes-Barre Scranton, PA International Airport Airshow. And that air show hosted the C-54 Spirit of Freedom, an aircraft that had participated in the Berlin Airlift support in 1948-49. It's now a flying museum about the airlift, owned and flown by the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation. He served as vice president of the Airlift Historical Foundation for 12 years. And as a planner and speaker for the Historical Foundation, Eddie's researched the airlift and met with many military participants and German recipients. One part of his task was the planning of and participating in a 70-day Berlin Airlift 50th anniversary tour of Europe with the Spirit of Freedom. And seeing Berlin and meeting its people was the stimulus for a continuing quest to learn everything about the airlift. And although now he's retired from the association, his interest continues with the Berlin Airlift Veterans Association as a board member and editor of The Legacy, the quarterly newsletter, and as a life member of the Air Force Association. His studies, interviews, and museum visits all contribute to speaking engagements in the eastern half of the country. And we are delighted to have Eddie this evening. So I am going to exit my slides and stop sharing and let Eddie bring up his presentation, and we can go ahead and get going.
Okay. Now, what am I doing now?
So you will share screen. So remember the green button at the bottom of the Zoom. Here we go. Here we go. All right. And then you just have to go to slideshow. And then from the beginning. And there we go.
There we are. My God.
There you are.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Eddie Ide, and I like that introduction. Thank you very much. Berlin got in my heart in 1998, as she said, and it's been my avocation since then. And so what we're going to talk about and what I'll give you is a short presentation of the Berlin Airlift. It was one of the most complex times in American history, and it was the largest non-combat military operation of the 20th century. And that is because it was Berlin Airlift. And here we are. This is actually the 75th anniversary of the Berlin Airlift. The airlift actually started, the actual operation began in April of 1948, but the blockade didn't begin until June 22nd, and by June 26th it was complete, and they began the airlift. General Lucius Clay was our commander, and he began the airlift without getting permission from Washington. His intention was to supply only our garrison of only 10,000 troops, but a British commander came forward with a plan to feed the whole city, which he adopted. And we'll get to that one in a second. But here's a brief on it. The 15-month-long humanitarian rescue effort by the Americans, the British, and the French, when the city was blockaded, as you see, in 1948 and 49. West Berlin had over 2.4 million people in it at the time. Now, the decisions that were made at Yalta in 1945 controlled actually the next 40 years, because this set the pace for the Cold War. Now, Crimea is where they met. That's where Yalta is. And Crimea, you're hearing about today because of the fighting that's on that section of the Ukraine. This was Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, on the left, President Roosevelt in the middle, and on the far right there is Joseph Stalin. They met in Yalta, and although it only shows 3 people there sitting, their entourage in total of the 3 gentlemen exceeded 700 people, agencies and different groups that had an influence in their decisions. It was a very unique position that because they didn't stay in the same building, their buildings were as much as 7 miles apart. And I've read many of the transcripts of what happened there, and most of it was very interesting, especially where Stalin had to go to an outdoor potty place, and he came out and he asked one of the American guards. He said, "Who is?" I'm trying to think of the gentleman's name that they used in World War II. I can't remember now. It'll come back to me when I get it. I'll tell you. But
Gilroy.
What's that?
Gilroy.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. All right. What they decided is that Germany and Berlin were going to be divided. The country was going to have 4 zones, and Berlin was going to have 4 sectors. Now, this was decided by the Allied Planning Commission that was set up after the 3 of them met in Tehran earlier, and it was decided and came forward and was accepted at Yalta. So this is the way it was broken down, and each of the governed areas would be governed by its occupier, and each of the occupiers had their own way of doing things. The biggest thing that happened then at Yalta is that Stalin made it known that he was going to move the western borders 200 miles into Poland, and then 200 miles of Germany was going to be given to Poland. And the reason he did that is because of the centuries, over the centuries, Russia had been attacked by the Germans and by the French, and he wanted to put an insulating barrier between Western Europe and Russia. It was kind of a self-defense mode, and that's what he started doing. But he made this move, and it was to go into effect as soon as they took over and were able to occupy that area. The area was called the Sudetenland and also Silesia. And Churchill and Stalin were not in a position to do anything about it. We didn't have enough troops in Europe to stop it. The Russians had over 3 million troops moving west from Russia toward Germany, and it was those troops that would eventually fight the Battle of Berlin a little later in the year. The result of that is that over 12 million ethnic Germans were forced to evacuate persecution from the Polish and the Russians. Remember, when the Germans invaded Poland in early 40s, they were brutal to the Polish people. The Germans were brutal to the Polish people. Then when the Russians came in at about the same time from the West, they were brutal against the Polish. And with this land being taken over, going to be taken over by the Polish, this land of Germany, the Polish took out their revenge on the ethnic Germans that lived there. Some of them were given as little as a half an hour to evacuate their homes. Now, a friend of mine, I just got an email from her today. She was with her parents, and her parents were part of this ethnic cleansing, if you will, from Silesia. And her grandparents had to walk almost 250 miles before they could escape from the Polish and the Russians. When they visited the house where her grandparents lived, while they were there just this past week, they visited the house that they had to walk away from in 1945. And when they went in the house, they were served coffee and tea in the same dishes that their grandparents had left there. They didn't say anything about it. They just drank the tea and the coffee. But that's the way it was then. Well, now here's the way it's divided. Germany was divided into 4 zones, and these are the 4 zones. On the right-hand side, of course, is the Russian zone, and then we have the German and the British and the French zone. Now, I'd like to point out that the French zone was not designated at Yalta. It came into play at Potsdam, which was in the middle of the year 1945, and the French zone was what they called the Ruhr area and the Saar area, and this was the coal zone. This was the producing zone of Germany. The top part of the French zone and the bottom part of the British zone was the coal mining area. And the French did not go along very well with the British and the Americans from 1945 until 1948, when they finally gave up their arguing about the possession of land there, because French wanted to absorb their German zone into France and take it completely away from Germany. Well, the Yalta meeting was in February. President Roosevelt died in early April, but in 1945, on the April 15th, our American troops were only 40 miles from Berlin, and you can see a line here, the broken line. They were only 40 miles from Berlin. Some of our patrols had gotten in all the way to Potsdam at that time. Now, one of the things I've learned over history is that all of the Germans that were in this area from where it says Potsdam, all along there, all the way down to Czechoslovakia, all those German troops that were in there were evacuating their way westward so that they could surrender to the Americans, because the Russians were coming in over here where it says incorporated. They were pressing in to Germany. And on that day, on April 15th, they were very close to attacking Germany. So Germany didn't have many elderly men in it at the time, because of the heavy losses they had suffered on the Eastern Front and also on the Western Front against the Americans and the Allies, moving up from Normandy as they curved their way up and across the Rhine. So Berlin was defended by young boys and old men. And if any of the men who were old enough to hold a weapon, if they refused to hold a weapon, the SS squads would hang them. They hung many of them on street lamps and in trees in Berlin, just to show that you had to participate in the oncoming battle. Now, this is a picture I took up in Reading, Pennsylvania, during their centennial celebration at the beginning of June every year, where they have a recreation of World War II. It's a World War II commemorative. And if you have things that you want to have in this display at Reading, if it isn't from World War II, they don't allow it. The Germans have a good contingent that comes over from Germany. Troops, recreators come in from Canada, they come in from Japan, and if you have a chance to go to it next year, it's already been this year, you have a chance, go to it. I think you'll find it very, very interesting. I took this picture of this young boy, and he's holding a replica of the Panzerfaust, which was a one-shot weapon to get a tank. If you were a boy in Berlin and they gave you a hat and they gave you a jacket, you had a Panzerfaust. And once you fired that, you were totally expendable. Thousands of those young boys died. Now, the thing is that the Battle of Berlin began on April 16th until their surrender on May 2nd. But May 2nd was not the end of the fighting, because small quarters of Germans held out for as much as 2 weeks after the official surrender. The Germans, or excuse me, the Russians suffered in the Battle of Berlin 80,000 dead soldiers. They had over 304,000 casualties, and many of those men went back to Russia and never survived their wounds. However, there was 80,000 Russians dead. Also, our 8th Air Force, during the battle, before the Russians made it into the city limits, we had bombing runs of over 1,000 B-17s and B-24s bombing the city while the Russians were attacking at the same time. It was one heck of a battle, to put it very mildly. So once the Berlin battle was over, the Russians refused to give us access until July. Our first troops didn't get in there until July the 1st. And when they got in there, they were treated badly by the Russians, by their actions, their body language, and their languages. And the Russians came in with 2 groups of prepared people. One of them was called the retribution squads, and they took anything that they wanted from the plants and the people in Russia. They took over and removed 1,000 railroad cars that were loaded with anything that they could use to rebuild Russia. Whole factories were ripped up and loaded on railroad cars. The Russian soldiers could ship as much as 10 pounds of goods back to Russia. Each one of them was allowed to ship that much. They wanted, a lot of the Russian soldiers took light bulbs and were going to, and sent them home, thinking all they had to do was screw them in and they were going to have electricity. Others stole toilets, because they were a lot of the second group that came in after when the Russians took over. After the first week, they replaced many of their Russian troops with the troops from Mongolia, and they never saw such things as toilets and as watches and light bulbs. Consequently, they would take anything they wanted from anybody. The Russians said that the Russian soldiers should enjoy the Germans and they can do what they wanted with them. And there were thousands of women raped and brutalized. 10% of the living women in the city of Berlin committed suicide during those 2 months, during June and July. Their actions removed any possibility of support that they might have received from the Russians. Now, here's a map of the city of Berlin, the way it was divided. And I think, you can see Tempelhof Airport down here in our section of the American sector. Gatow was over here on the left. And then during the airlift in August of 1948, we began construction of Tegel Airport up in the French zone, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Down at the bottom here on the right-hand side, that is Schönefeld. That's where their air base was. That is now has been expanded and greatly enhanced, and it is now called Berlin International. When you fly to Berlin now, you're going to land at the old Schönefeld base, which is Berlin International. We used to land up at Tegel, and it was a beautiful airport, and it was very small, but it was a beautiful little airport to get in and out of. So that's the zone. That's what we're going to be talking about, are the 3 sectors in Berlin. Now, we arrived there the 1st of July. General, he was a colonel at the time. Colonel Frank Hawley was our commander in Berlin when he first got there, and he stayed there right through 1949 until after the airlift left. and he was a hard-headed advertising man out of Philadelphia. And he went in there with an attitude that the Russians are going to be our friends, and that's what he was told. But his tune changed very, very quickly once they got into Berlin. Now, in June, in June of 1945, the Allies met again. Now, Clement Attlee replaced Winston Churchill. President Truman had just taken over less than a month earlier and had really studied hard to get ready to meet Stalin. And Stalin was Stalin, and he was the person that really pulled all the chains and made things happen. We did not have the army at the time in Europe to face off against the Russians. They still had, even in 1948, they had over 300,000 troops within a 100-mile radius of Berlin. And they were ready to take it over at any time. I'd just like to point out one minor thing. If you notice the way the chairs are closer together where Attlee is seated and President Truman, and the distance between Stalin and Truman, when Winston Churchill got there, he moved his chair over closer so he would be closer to President Truman. And it stayed that way through the conference at Potsdam. Now, the Potsdam conference didn't do very much. There were a lot of details to it that I can't get into. We don't have time, but there were a lot of details to it. And the thing about the Potsdam conference, it was mostly a reaffirmation of what they had made at Yalta. Truman didn't make any attempt to stop the takeover of the eastern or the western part of Germany that Russia had already started moving into and where people were evacuating. But Berlin was a city in ruins, and the city in ruins had over 3,400,000 people in it. That was the combined city. I'd just like to point out one thing, and that thing is that these pictures were taken later. You can see the streets are cleared of the rubble. Well, the street, even on that picture, was cleared in the rubble. These pictures were taken in 1948. So there was plenty of time to get the debris up. Now, but the city of Berlin was 60% destroyed. There wasn't a pane of glass that wasn't broken. If your building wasn't bombed, the concussion from the 4 years of bombing by the British and the Americans would shatter all of the windows. But this was a shot from over in the eastern zone, and that's looking west into the city. Excuse me. There's the ruin dwellers, and if you notice, these people are cleaning up the debris, and they got paid. The ruin dwellers actually got paid the equivalent of $1.25 in today's money per hour, and they worked mostly all daytime hours. And in the summer, they worked a lot. In the winter, they didn't work as much because of the cold weather. But that debris that you see there was all cleared by hand. And thousands and thousands of women worked on that because Berlin was women. It wasn't very many men in it at all. 75% of the population was women. Now, this is the way that the annexation of Poland took over. You can see on the left the way Germany was in 1939, and on the right, 1946. You see, they lost a lot of people. That area in Poland, that was at the top part of that was Silesia was in over here in this section here, and then right above that was the other section. And this is where all of those 12 million people had to evacuate from. But it wasn't only from Poland. They also came from Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Austria. to get away from the Russians. So here they are, some of them going west, and I've got many pictures of them. And 1945 is when it happened. 1946 and 47, we got along fairly close with the Russians until about mid-1946. By then, Russia had started to establish what we knew as the Iron Curtain, a separation between Western Europe and the Russian area. That included Latvia and Lithuania, all the way down through the Ukraine. So those are people that had to go, and they were flooding into Berlin by train and by walking. Most of them had to walk. So our commander was General Lucius Clay. General Lucius Clay is kind of a hero of mine, quite frankly. He graduated in the class of 1919, but they graduated West Point in early 1918 because the war was breaking out in Europe, and they anticipated going to Europe to fight before he could get prepared to embark. The war ended, and he was then assigned to be in the engineering corps. So until December 7th, 1941, from 1919 to 1941, he didn't even have to wear a uniform. He was in the Army Engineer Corps, except for a brief time when he went to the Philippines, and that's where he hooked up with General Patton and also General Eisenhower, who would bring him to Europe after the war as his assistant. During the war, General Clay was put in charge of acquisition. His orders as a colonel, he was told at a meeting a week after Pearl Harbor, he was called to a meeting by General Eisenhower. And at that meeting, he was told that General Clay was going to be in charge of acquisition. And that acquisition was to include anything that the Army needed. So he was at top of the heap of getting things for the military, from tents to shoes to planes, airplanes, ships, and everything in between. Everything rested on his shoulders for the decision making. In 1937, he was brought forward from his assignment in Texas, and he was put in charge of building airports. He was responsible for building airports all over the United States, in Charlotte, for example, in Philadelphia, in New York, Chicago, and Atlanta, because they anticipated war even in 1937 and 38, and they knew the importance of airplanes was growing at that time. So now 1946 and 47 and 48, those were years of crisis. Most of the world was recovering from World War II, and many nations were in turmoil, especially the Middle East, where Israel was being established. The communists had taken over a good part of the control of Italy. They were working on France. They had taken over a good part of the control of Finland, and they were working on Norway. Europe was still in ruins, and the Berlin was the boiling point of the world, because in China there was a revolution going on, and the Middle East was really in turmoil. And we reinstituted the draft in June of 1948. A lot of folks weren't aware of that one. Now, in January 1948, the Russians were giving problems with the Allies, with the British and the French and the Americans at their meetings that were held on a regular basis in Germany. They had two councils. One council was the Allied Control Council. That was the control council for the better part of Germany. That would be the zones. And then the sectors were being administered by a control council called the Kommandatura. The Russians stonewalled at the meetings. They didn't want to move anything forward from their idea of socialism and communism. And all of these people were flooding into Berlin at the same time. It was a real quagmire in Berlin. And besides that, the Allies had to deal with not only the Russians coming into their sectors and kidnapping people, even in 1948, but they also had to deal with the influx of all of these people. Now, at the same time, in April of 1948, the Marshall Plan went into effect. Now, 16 nations were getting items that were produced in the United States so that Europe could get rebuilt. There were actually 18 nations that were invited to participate. Czechoslovakia was invited to participate, and believe it or not, we invited Russia to participate in that. Well, Russia declined. And then before we began deliveries, the administrative aide in charge of Czechoslovakia was murdered. He was thrown out of his building. They said it was suicide. However, they found plaster under his fingernails, and his teeth had been pulled out before he was committed suicide out of the windows. But with the Marshall Plan coming in, that was one of the things that the Russians didn't like, of course. Now, the separation was complete because they walked out of the Commandatura on June the 16th, 1948. Now, in 1948, the Russians started having problems with the roads and with the canals, and also they wouldn't allow trains to come into Berlin. They stopped them intermittently in April and May, and it came to a head in June, because on June the 18th, the Allies issued new currency. On the left is the old German Reichsmark note that was the money that was printed by the Reich from 1910. And the Russians got the plates for that, and the Russians printed that money so great that it was handled like trash because it had no value. Now, what General Clay did, he had the money printed up in the United States, the one marked with the B on the side. That was released first in West Berlin, or excuse me, in West Germany. And then on the 18th, they released it in Berlin. And all of this money was held secret, produced secretly, brought into Berlin secretly. And then they had guys, they had a crew of people, not soldiers, but civilians, stamping the money with a B. After this money was released, and everyone in Berlin, every adult in Berlin got the equivalent of $60. That would be the equivalent. They got the equivalent of $60. People that had large amounts of money lost most of it because it was all in the Reichsnote, and it was lost to them. A lot of older people lost their life savings as they started anew with the new money. So this was the crisis of 1948. On the 10th, the Russians attempted to move locomotives and rail cars from Berlin. They had already moved over 100 that had been loaded and moved. I was able to get a transcript of the boy who was the father of the commander that was in charge of stopping the Russians there. It said they had to use their rifles, but they actually had to move a tank into position. The Russians had 2 machine gun trucks ready to shoot if they couldn't get them. And then our guy waved his arm, and up over the hill came a couple of tanks. The Russians backed down on that. So on the 16th, like I said, the Russians walked down on the Kommandatura because they couldn't find out what had happened at the meeting in London. So that was part of that. On the 16th, the Congress developed and instituted a peacetime draft. Now, we weren't even out of the war a full 3 years yet, and they instituted the draft. On Friday, was they instituted the currency reform. Travel restrictions were increased by the Russians. And then on the 26th, the full blockade came in. Now, the first C-54s began arriving in Germany on the 28th. There were two of them in Europe. And we actually had two of them in Europe under General Curtis LeMay's charge, along with our C-47s. And I'll show you those in a moment. Then on the 28th, the call went out through the Air Force and through Curtis LeMay for the aircraft to be moved, and they started moving them from Alaska and from Hawaii. And the response from the Russians, because of those things that happened, was to blockade the whole city. They ripped up the roads, ripped up the railroad tracks, closed the canals, and we only had access by air. Here's the Russian excuses for the blockade, and you can read that if you will, but the real reason was to cause food riots and move their troops into the city, and so to prove that the Allies had no control over the city. A lot of people weren't aware of it, but during the Nazi era in 1944, there were food riots in Berlin. And the German troops had to go in to quell the food riots in Berlin, and they were living in Berlin at the time. But so they had these three good reasons. That's what the Russians felt. That was their reasoning for the situation. Now, when the blockade began, General Curtis LeMay, General Clay, got the excuse me. He had the plan that I told you from the British commander, and he looked that over and he agreed that that would work, the plan that was submitted by the British. So he called General Curtis LeMay and he asked him, he said, "Can you deliver coal to Berlin?" General Curtis LeMay, he hesitated and he said, "Excuse me, General Clay." He said, "Did you say coal to Berlin?" He said, "Yes, I did, General Clay. Can you do that?" And he said something the Air Force still uses today. The Air Force can deliver anything. So they called on our depots that were in Germany, that were storehouses of the remnants of World War II. And amongst them were duffel bags and trailers and tractors. So they got 400 tractors, excuse me, and 600 trailers. And they started moving them to the bases where they would get the supplies to move to the aircraft. They used over 1,000 duffel bags to start loading the coal, and that's what they moved it in. Now, to begin the airlift, we were flying the C-47, and that's you might remember that, some of you folks. It's a good airplane. There's still about 75 of them flying today. They only have a 2.5-ton capacity and two engines. They're very reliable. These are they still had stripes on them because most of them had been used in the Normandy invasion. And there's another picture. That picture for me as a guy that likes airplanes, just couldn't resist putting that one up. So beautiful picture of a C-47. Then the other airplane was the Douglas C-54 called the Skymaster. They arrived in June from bases that were worldwide. Like I said, they left from Hawaii, they left from Alaska, and we would eventually use over 300 of these would be used in the airlift. Now, they started off with about 50 of these airplanes. This is one of the airplanes that started the airlift. This is the C-54D. It's owned by the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation. We fly in it, and it's a beautiful airship. It's currently right at Elizabeth City, North Carolina. We're waiting for new propellers because the propellers have to be taken off and inspected every 5 years. And the cycling was early this year, and we pulled the propellers off. We're waiting for them. And we hope to have this back in the air by mid-July. That's the anticipation. But she's a beautiful ship, and she flies beautiful. And this is one of the airplanes that we had This is our second one. Our first one got destroyed by a tornado. And then we located this airplane in Florida, and our volunteer members got it flying again, and it was all certified and everything by the FAA. This is the airplane that we flew to Colonel Halverson's funeral, and we'll get to him in just a minute. Here's what was available in 1948. They had a total of only 444 of these airplanes at the time. And during the airlift, over 312 of them were committed to the airlift. We had a training base set up in Great Falls, Montana, and they used 19 of them. Now, 68 airplanes at a time were in what they call the maintenance pipeline. When the airplanes achieved 200 hours, they had to go in for an inspection, 200 hours. Now, these airplanes were flying as much as 16, some of them 18 hours a day. So it didn't take long to build up 200 hours. At 1,000 hours, they had to fly back to the United States, into Texas and into Oklahoma, and they were completely cleaned and rebuilt essentially. But it took a month to get the airplanes in and out of these pipelines. So sometimes, most of the time, we only had about as little as 225 airplanes available to fly the airlift. The operations at the bases continued around the clock. Now, here's a typical scene. This is a C-54 being unloaded by German laborers. Many of them were from Poland as evacuees. We call them displaced persons. The GIs would drive the trucks. And when the airplane pulled into Tempelhof, like that is, the engines on the left-hand side, the propellers would still be spinning when the trailers backed up to the open doors. When they first started, it was taking over a half an hour to get the planes unloaded. In a reasonable amount of only 3 months, they were unloading airplanes in as little as 10 minutes. And one of them actually set a record of 5 minutes and 7 seconds to completely unload an airplane that had 200 sacks of coal, 100 pounds in a sack. And that's what they were doing. So this is a map of the area, a full map. And you can see Berlin is on the far right there. Our bases were down here at the bottom. We had Rhein-Main and Wiesbaden. Rhein-Main was at Frankfurt, of course. And our base for the supply depot was down here at over half. Yeah, they just called it Obi. Let's call it that, okay? Because I can't pronounce it, and I don't pretend to. Oberpfaffenhofen. Anyway, we were up here. The British were up here in the top. Now you'll see here at Celle and Fossberg. Well, in July, General Tunner, who was our commander at the time for the flying, he recognized that the corridors, there were 3 air corridors that Russia had agreed to. They signed that in an agreement in October of 1945, and it was the only agreement that they signed. Now, the Russians wouldn't agree anything verbally, but if they signed it, they had to stick with it, and that's what they did. Now, so when they began flying from our bases in Rhein-Main into Berlin, it was 217 miles into Berlin flying that way. However, if they flew from Celle and Fossberg, they could use the Northern Corridor, and the Northern Corridor, they could get into the city in less than an hour. So we could get 3 planes into Berlin from Fossberg and Celle in a time that we took 2 planes flying from Rhein-Main and Wiesbaden. So we moved a lot of airplanes up to Celle and Fossberg in July and in August. The corridors, each one was 20 miles wide to an altitude of 10,000 feet. we used the northern and the southern corridor as entry corridors, and the middle corridor, it was one-way traffic coming out of Berlin. And that worked out very well. Now, the British were flying aircraft too. We were not the only ones flying airplanes. The British had 7 airplanes that they flew airplanes from, and they're shown here. They flew from Lubeck and from Schleswig-Land. That was where the float planes were, and you'll have a picture of those in just a minute. That's where the float planes were. But it worked out very well, very well. This is Tempelhof. Now, Tempelhof, this was taken in I think this was 1970. The building itself was built by the Germans in 1935. They began it in 1935. It was almost done completely by the time we started bombing in 1941. It was 3/4 of a mile from one end down to the other end down here. This dark area in the middle is actually high enough that even a Boeing 737 or an Airbus 320 would fit and can taxi inside there. That's where the Germans built it so that they could unload passenger planes in that. It was an absolutely beautiful airport. 7 floors underground. Underground during the war, they were building airplanes down there, and there was a hospital down there, and large barracks were down there. When the Russians came in and took it over, they flooded the bottom 2 floors, but I was in the one of the 4th floors under the ground, and it was absolutely fantastic and unique being in there. So that's what they were in. Now, to land in Tempelhof, that was the fun part, I think, for me anyway. When we came in over the building, just like that airplane did there, we were 100 feet above the top of this building. Now, that building was not in good condition when the airlift was going on, but it was kind of unique to come in. And then later, when they built another runway, because we only had a grass sod runway in 1945, and then in 2 months after the airlift started, they started working on an asphalt runway, and then you had to fly in between 2 buildings. The distance apart was about the length of a football field, and your airplane had to fly in the middle of those buildings to land in Berlin. It was very difficult to do. There are C-47s there being unloaded, and that's the same way they used to line up the C-54s. Now, to make sure that the airlifters were not intercepted by the Russians, because to get to Berlin, you had to fly over Russian bases. You had to fly over 3 of them coming out from Wiesbaden, and you had to fly over 2 of them coming out of Celle and Fossberg. So we had 90 airplanes go to Europe, 60 to England, and 30 went over to Germany. These were not nuclear capable airplanes. Those airplanes were nicknamed silver plates. These aircraft that they sent over there were straight gravity bombs. They flew from into Berlin from Rapid City, South Dakota, was committed 2 squadrons of the B-29s to get over to Berlin. General LeMay made it known to the Russians, because he was a very outspoken person, that he was prepared to bomb all of the Russian bases in Berlin, in Germany, if one of our airplanes, one of our cargo planes, was shot down, and then he was going to go directly to Moscow. Now, to get into Berlin, they were flying what they call a conveyor belt. Now, this shows 2 different levels of flight, but when they started, it was 5 levels of flight. Well, the 5 levels of flight got to be rather congested at Tempelhof and at Gatow Air Base, so they reduced it to 2 levels. As you can see, they were flying horizontally 6 minutes apart, and at a different altitude. They flew 500 foot of vertical separation. There was as many as 37 to 40 airplanes on the conveyor belt flying into Berlin at any one time. And that started almost immediately in June or in July 1st, 1948, and it continued until the end of September 1949. Yeah, July was a transition month. Lieutenant Gail Halverson began giving candy to the kids. Truman approved additional airplanes for the airlift, and General Tunner arrived to command the airlift. And we had the first crash in Berlin. There was crashes, of course, and we'll talk on those. July 18th, a lieutenant, Gail Halverson, he met the children at the fence, as you can see. And he had talked to kids during the war because he was a pilot flying support missions into Italy and into Africa. He was a Mormon, and he wouldn't do any alcohol at all, and a great guy. And he became a friend of mine, and he met the kids. And these kids, they talked to him about the airplanes. They didn't ask him for anything. They didn't ask him for gum or candy and chocolate and stuff. They didn't ask for that. Most of these kids were birthed during the war, and there were some in there that were older, and they said to him, these are, it's good you're flying in now and you're getting your airplane in over the building almost every 3 minutes. And one of the girls said to him, she said, in the winter, you're not going to be able to do that. She said, we don't care if we're skinny, but if we lose our freedom, we'll never get it back. Well, he had made arrangements for a ride to take him back to a plane to go back to Rhine-Main, where he took a day. He didn't skip a day. He flew his missions, and then he hopped on another plane going to Berlin because he wanted to get movies of the airplanes landing over the building. So he got his movies. He said hello to the kids, goodbye to the kids. He started to walk away, and he reached in his pocket. He had 2 sticks of Wrigley spearmint gum. He broke it in half, and he said to me, he told me many times, he said, I had the gum, and I knew the kids were going to fight over it, but they had to have the gum. So he went to the fence, he gave them the gum, four pieces of gum. The kids who got the gum, they ate it quick. They thought it was food. But the other kids got a piece of the paper. At that time, they used to have silver foil on it, you might remember. And the kids who got it, all of the kids got a piece of the paper, and they smiled. And he thought, wow, if I can make them smile with this. He said, I've got candy at my barracks. Well, he told them, he said, kids, when I come in tomorrow, I'm going to drop candy for you. And they said, well, how will we know it's you? There's a plane come in every 3 minutes. So he showed them by putting his arms straight out from his side and wiggling them up and down. He said, I'll wiggle my wings. Look for the plane that wiggles its wings. Well, he showed them. The next day, well, before he left, they called him Uncle Wiggly Wings. So the next day, they were looking for Uncle Wiggly's airplane, Uncle Wiggly Wings. Well, when his airplane came over, they dropped the 3 parachutes out of the flare chute, which was behind the pilot, and the kids got it. And when he flew out, the kids were waving the 3 parachutes through the fence. Well, they did it. And the next week, they only got their rations once a week. So the next week, he did the same thing. And there wasn't 30 kids. Now there was about 300 kids. Well, the following week, he did it a third time. And the third time, there was over 1,000 kids out there waiting to see the airplane and see if they can get candy. Well, he walked into base operations at Berlin to get instructions for his flight back to Rhine-Main. And when he walked into base operations to get his orders, because they all had to do that at the time, there were 3 big packages of mail addressed to Uncle Wiggly Wings and the Chocolater Fliegen, the chocolate flyer. Well, he went back to his crew and he said, we're not doing this again. He said, we're going to get in trouble. Well, he didn't know it, because the next day when he flew in to get his instructions in Berlin and he flew back to Rhine, Maine, he was met by the air police, and they said, you have to go and see the commander. So he went in to meet Colonel Hahn, who happened to be his commander. And he said, Lieutenant Halverson, he said, what have you been doing? And he saluted him and he said, sir, I'm doing whatever I can to help the people in Berlin. He said, don't give me that. He said, look, he picked up a newspaper from the side and it had a picture of his airplane with the parachutes. And he said, I just got a complimentary call from General Tunner, who complimented me for this great morale builder that he heard about. He said, and I didn't know anything about it. I'm your commanding officer. I'm supposed to know what you're doing. And I didn't know it. He said, I should court-martial you. He said, but General Tunner thinks it's a good idea. So go ahead and keep it going. And Colonel Hahn got up and shook his hand, and it began what they named it Operation Little Vittles. Now, the story took over very fast, and it caught the imagination of Americans all over the country, because they sent him to New York, and he did a radio program and a TV program, black and white TV, in 1948. And he did a TV program, and the impact was that parachutes started being made all over the United States with candy bars attached to them by Lions clubs and Rotary clubs and Elks clubs and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And then it was all shipped up to Westover Air Force Base to be shipped to the candy bomber in Berlin. Gail Halverson, we knew him as Colonel Gail Halverson. He was responsible for getting over 20,000 pounds of candy delivered to the people in Berlin, and not just the kids. If he couldn't get it to a hospital, he would go and deliver it himself. If he could, he would mail it to people. The ones that touched him the most, he has told me, was when he went to the polio hospital. At that time, there were people in iron lungs, and polio was a very crippling disease. In 1948, he told me that that's the one that touched him the most, when he had to reach and hand candy to a young person who was laying flat on their back in an iron lung. Now, this is Gail in 2018 at the Air Force Memorial, and that's the uniform he wore all the time. On the left side of his Ike jacket, that's a Canadian wings, because he earned his wings through the Canadian Air Force while he was a member of the Civil Air Patrol before he joined the Army Air Force in 1940. So 41. So on July the 20th, that's when General Clay had gone to Washington to meet with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, to a member, said we should let Berlin go. General Clay was really disappointed. And as President Truman was leaving the meeting, he turned to General Clay and said, General, he said, will you stop in my office before you leave? Well, that was in late evening. In the morning, he went in to see the president, and President Truman said to him, he said, General Clay, I guess you're pretty disappointed, aren't you? He said, yes, sir, I am. He said, we really need to save the city of Berlin. He said, don't worry, General, you'll get your airplanes. And that's when he told General Wiedemeyer later in that day, he said, you give General Clay all the airplanes he needed. And that's when they really began an effort to get them there. And by the end of August, they had almost 250 airplanes heading to or had been on their way and flying into Berlin into Germany and into the city of Berlin. Now, on July 25th, General Tunner took over. He was known as Willie the Whip. Now, General Tunner was noted because he was the prime person for cargo aircraft. He ran the hump operation in India, flying supplies to the Chinese over the Himalaya Mountains in 1944 and 1945. When he took it over, it was the worst place to go in the Air Force, in the Army Air Force. General Tunner turned it around. He instituted the first rescue teams, aviation rescue teams, to rescue pilots that had crashed in the jungle. He cut the airtime down. He got C-54s over there. They cut the cargo time down, and they cut their casualty rate down. He was the prime man for air cargo. And he was the man now that was going to run the Berlin Airlift, and that's what he did. Now, he got there on the 25th. Later that night, on the morning of the 26th, a C-54, a C-47 rather, crashed in the street and struck the apartment house. Now, the fuel burned in the street, not on the apartment house. You can see that tree still has its leaves on it, but the fabric on the back tail end of the airplane was all burned off. But they cleared the wreckage, and when they cleared the wreckage, flowers were put out there, and fresh flowers have been maintained at that site in Berlin. Even today, 75 years later, they still maintain fresh flowers on that site where this plane crashed. And a month later, a month after the crash, a brass plaque was placed on the building, and it's still there, saying that we will never forget you. There's a long litany on it, and it says, we will never forget you, the two pilots who sacrificed their lives to save Berlin. And that was a critical point, because up to that point, the Americans and the British were accepted, but they weren't really welcomed. Well, with this plane crash, it proved that the Americans and the British were willing to sacrifice their lives to save the city of Berlin. And the attitude of the Berliners changed to be a positive attitude for the Allies. They said after this crash, if you were a GI in Berlin, you couldn't pay for a beer and you couldn't pay for a meal, because the Berliners were welcoming you that much. All right. Now, let me see what we got here. Okay. All right. Now, what they needed in Berlin to get everybody going right, because when we got into late September, October, and November, the weather turned. It wasn't the snow that was coming, it was fog. There was a heavy bank of fog came into all of Europe, and it was so bad, sometimes airplanes that could land, they couldn't even see other airplanes on the ground. One pilot told me that when he landed in the fog, he was talked into the ground by ground controlled approach. That is, a guy in the trailers there was looking at that airplane on a round screen, and he could see the dot that represented his airplane. And that airplane was flying a beam that was right at the end of the runway. And he told me that he landed GCA, ground controlled approach, talked him into the ground, and he just taxied. He thought he saw a taxiway, and he turned, started going down what he thought was a taxiway, and he just felt something. He said, it just didn't seem right. I stopped my airplane and shut the engines off. His airplane stopped less than 6 feet to another airplane that was parked. That's how deep the fog was. But GTA was the control thing that saved the airlift. Now, the air operations continued around the clock. Everybody was working 12 to 14 hours a day. Now, it wasn't just Americans. It was the British also, because the British had a collection of airplanes. The British had a collection of airplanes, and they flew a third of everything that was going into Berlin. The Americans, we flew primarily coal. So our airplanes were either black or white on the inside, and so were the pilots. By 2 flights into Berlin, the coal dust was so bad The pilots looked like coal miners, and if they were flying flour, they looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. But the RAF, the Royal Air Force, they were flying the clean goods, the medicines and the necessary things that people need to live on and survive. The dehydrated food, the fresh food if they could get it, and the supplies, everything that the people needed except water. And the RAF flew that in, but the RAF had empty airplanes on the way out, and they were clean. So they started taking out people that had hardships. Hospital patients, especially elderly. They got over 117,000 West Berliners to West Germany to escape the hardships of the airlift. And hospital patients, as it says there, they had top priority. Now, they not only had their own airplanes, and these are their airplanes. The one on the top right was called the York. They had 40 of those. The plane in the middle was a seaplane. And why would they use a seaplane in an airlift? Well, the seaplane had corrosion protection, and the salt that they've moved it got shook, and it got into everything in the airplanes, but it couldn't get high enough to get at the cables that were in the big airplane called the Sunderland. And the Sunderland flew until the river froze in December. So after that, they started using the plane up on the top left there with a planter underneath the bottom, and that's where they started moving the liquid fuels. And they also started using the planters to move to move the salt. Now, this is typical in Berlin. There was a struggle constantly for the cold and the hunger and the fear. Berliners would go to a movie. They didn't care what the movie was. They would get in the movie just to get warm, because all the body heat in the movie would be warm enough that you could actually remove your heavy overcoat. But the Berliners survived. They had a low calorie rate every day. It depended on the job and the responsibilities you had. If you were just a basic laborer, you didn't get very much food. If you were just a person living in a home, you got even less food. The priority went to those people that were working on the airlift. On the airlift, we had over 118,000 people working on the airlift. And they were loaders and unloaders. Everything had to be loaded by hand and unloaded by hand. The people that were loaders worked 8 hours a day. They got a hot meal, and they took half of the hot meal home with them. And the other thing they got was the equivalent to of $1.25 an hour. And that was what they got. So everything going into Berlin, and here's just a brief of them. I'm not going to go over everything, but you can see the total of coal was the most, because they needed the coal for the sewer plant, the gas plant, the water plant, and the electric power. And the electric power, actually, most of it came from the Russian zone, from the Russian sector, rather, because the British, in the British zone in 1945, when the Russians took over, they took the power plant apart. So there wasn't much electricity available to get into Berlin. During the airlift, the Berliners got 4 hours of electricity a day, 2 hours during the daylight hours and 2 hours at night, but they never knew when the electricity was going to be turned on. So they had to stay awake. Somebody had to stay awake. So when the lights went on, they would hurry up and cook and iron and do whatever they could, because it only stayed on for 2 hours. The same thing was true with the gas. When the gas was monitored, and there were a lot of asphyxiations, because when people were cooking, they never knew when the gas was going to shut off. And if they were cooking something and the gas would shut off, your flame stops, but the gas keeps coming out of the pipe. And when it comes back on. So what happened, a lot of people were asphyxiated by the gas because it was shut off when they were cooking. So those are some of the hardships. It's hard to describe them. One of the ladies I talked to, her job as a young girl was to go into the buildings and scrape off the wallpaper. Now, what she did, she took the wallpaper home, and her mother would get the wallpaper and put it in hot water, and it would dissolve. And wallpaper at that time was made out of flour to hold it on. It was made with a flour-based material. There was no artificial chemicals in the coloring also. And her mother would just throw in a rose petal or anything, and she would concoct a soup from the wallpaper. And that's what that girl did. And she's a member of the Berlin Airlift Veterans Association. Now she lives in California. So there we are. But coal was the lifeblood in Berlin. And as I said, it was for the cooking, the power plant, the sewer plant, the warming. The warming rooms were nothing more than bomb shelters that the Nazis built in after we started bombing Berlin in 1941. They started building bomb shelters. They were 6 feet of concrete over the people that were in the rooms. A friend of mine who now lives up in Montgomery, Alabama, he was born in one of those warming rooms the first night that the British bombed in 1941. And he was a member of our group for a while. There was no heat in the schools, and the hospitals got very, very little heat. But everything going into Berlin went on somebody's back. We landed an airplane every 3 minutes for 15 months. Actually, when you do the math and break it down, we landed an airplane every 2 minutes and 45 seconds. But we rounded it up, and the Air Force says it was every 3 minutes, so we go with every 3 minutes. But they needed another airfield. We only had 2. We only had Gatow and Tempelhof. With all the airplanes we had, they were getting pretty crowded. So the French volunteered land at Tegel in their zone. And to meet the needs of the city, the runway was built in less than 90 days. Most of as you see on the left-hand side, the women were in charge of chipping off the concrete from the bricks, and the bricks then went to crushers, and then they were spread on the fields, and the runway was 150 feet wide and 5,500 feet long. And they made it in 90 days. They landed it. 40% of the work was done by the women. Now, one of the things that happened is that on the approach end of the runway, the Russians had 2 antennas, 2 large vertical antennas. 250 feet high was one, and the other one was 150 feet. They were close enough that the pilots were concerned about their safety. The French commander sent a letter to the Russian commander and said, please remove these. He sent it 3 times. And in the one letter, he said, if you don't remove them, I'll remove them. Well, it was in December, he called all the Americans, and there wasn't many at Tegel because it was going to be operated by the French. He called all the American officers into his office at the airport at Tegel, and he locked the door behind them. And everybody was wondering why. They were having coffee and everything. And all of a sudden, they heard 2 explosions. And they looked at the window, and General Koenig said to his guests, he said, you will have no more problems with the antennas. And when the Russian commander came in to see him raising hell in plain language, he said, how could you do this? And he said, Monsieur, with dynamite. And that was the end of that. The Russians never quabbled him after that. So the winter came, and the winter was not, the snow was not a problem, only the fog was a problem. The worst time we had was in the end of October and early November, when we could only land airplanes. Only 4 of them were able to get into Berlin that one day. And the very next days after that, we had 700 airplanes landing at Tempelhof the very next day after that one day. Well, anyway, as you can see, there's airplanes there. And the reason I have that, you'll notice the gasoline truck. Well, the Navy, United States Navy, They provided 8 million gallons of aviation gas a month. It came in through Schleswig-Land up at Bremerhaven, at the port of Bremerhaven, and then it was transferred by truck and train down to the small tank trucks that took it out to the airports. It was a great job by the Navy. The Navy provided 2 squadrons, VR-6 and VR-8. They flew in from Guam, and they had a very good track record. You Navy folks got to be proud, because you had the best squadrons in the Berlin Airlift with VR-6 and VR-8. So they held all good marks all the way through in safety, in flying, and they lost one airplane that crashed, one of their airplanes, and only one of their sailors unfortunately lost his life. So this was typical of winter. Stalin was convinced that Old Man Winter and General Fog were going to stop the airlift. Now, you might wonder why he would think that. Well, think for a minute. Do you remember what happened at Stalingrad? At Stalingrad, they moved German airplanes from Africa and took them up into a Russian winter. And they lost over 425 airplanes that froze to the ground when they landed. And they had a very unsuccessful airlift into Berlin to support their 900,000 troops. And they had Germans surrender. Almost 1 million German soldiers had to surrender at Stalingrad. It was a disaster for the German army. That's why Stalin thought that the Berlin airlift was going to be stopped by Old Man Winter and General Fog, and it did not. Ice and snow didn't stop our mechanics. And on the left-hand side, you'll see how basic their shelters were, and the way their airplane was in what they called the nose dock. Well, we had those nose docks at in Obi and at excuse me, and there's a Rhine-Main and at Wiesbaden. But it didn't stop our mechanics. They worked at it and they did their job, and they pulled everything off. Now, here's the needs of the city, and I've got some figures in there from December of 48 and 1949. And you'll see there was a substantial increase in the tonnage, 10,000 tons. 10,000 tons increase, plus the number of flights increased by 100. And that's every day now. That's the average of the flights. And you can see the average there dropped down to 2.5 minutes. Every 2.5 minutes, an airplane was landing. In March, the blockade proved useless because there was more things coming into Berlin by airplane than had been coming in by road and rail and by the canals. So the Russians had no choice but to give up the airlift. Now, General Tunner, Willie the Whip, he wanted to keep up morale. He was afraid morale was getting slow, even though they started transitioning the troops home and giving them a chance to get home. Some of them had been given TDY orders, temporary duty orders, for 30 days. And some of them stayed there as long as 6 and 7 months on those 30-day orders. So they had new people. He was afraid they were getting lax because they were getting so many things into Berlin. So he decided he was going to have something going special. And he put on the Easter parade on Saturday, April 15th. They began flying. They stood down for 12 hours before that, preparing airplanes. And then they flew only one cargo into Berlin from noon Saturday to noon on Sunday. And in those 24 hours, you can see they landed with 12,941 tons of coal. That was the equivalent of 300 coal cars, 300 railroad cars filled with coal. And they made it in 1,398 flights. General Tunner was trying to get an airplane in there every minute during that time. He didn't quite make it. They only landed an airplane every 63 seconds. So it was a big victory. And once the Easter parade was over, the the stuff going into Berlin didn't decrease. They maintained a level prior. They maintained a level that was higher than they had done before the Easter parade. Now, the airlift was not just the Air Force. It was the Army, it was the Navy, and it was the Marine Corps and the United States Air Force. The Marine Corps supported the Navy by transatlantic flights, and they took care of the training for the Navy pilots. The Navy also supplied the fuel. The Army was there to supervise the loading and the unloading, and also they ran the hospitals, and they were prepared to defend Berlin. However, in reality, between the British and the French and the Americans, we only had 21,900 troops in the city of Berlin. And if the Russians wanted to take over Berlin, they would have done it in a matter of hours, not days. But they held off because we did have the nuclear weapons and Russia did not have them at that time. But we had B-29s, and we had moved some of these silver plate airplanes into Europe. They were in England with nuclear weapons by the end of the airlift, even though the Russians were not aware of it. So there we are. That was what was happening. There's a total of numbers. We had a high amount of German loaders. I said it was 145, but it was only 45,000. But we still had a lot of people involved in it, over 70,000, and that didn't include anybody in Europe. In Burtonwood, where we had over 2,500 Americans working on the inspections of the airplanes that had hit the 200-mile mark. And that was at a place called Burtonwood, which is in northwest England. It's a closed air base now, but at the time, it was the largest Air Force establishment in Europe. Outside of the United States, it was the biggest. The other thing that's not included is all the employees that were in the United States rebuilding airplanes and rebuilding the engines. And they were in Texas and Pennsylvania. There was about 7 locations in the country rebuilding the airplanes that were being flown. And it does not include the Berlin Constabulary. All right, now here's what happened. On May the 12th, 1949, the Berlin Airlift came to an end because there were negotiations going on in New York at the new United Nations to close the airlift between the Russians and the Americans. And the representatives sent correspondence to Stalin, and he didn't really say that he quit. He phrased it another way. He said, we're not arguing about the money anymore, something similar to that. And if they would have a prime minister meeting in France a month after the airlift ended, he would agree to that. So they set the date for May the 12th, and they closed on May the 12th. Now, we continued the airlift until the end of September in case the Russians decided to reinstitute the blockade. They didn't. They caused problems after the airlift was over, but they were minor in comparison to the airlift and the blockade. Now, the first trucks to arrive after the blockade was ended, they carried care packages. And during the Berlin airlift, there were over 250,000 care packages bought by United States citizens that were transported to Germany by the Air Force. The Air Force ended the airlift on September 30th, 1949, 15 months of flying, 277,569 total flights. Now, I have to be honest, the British didn't end the airlift on September the 7th. They flew the airlift until October the 7th, but then they're on the metric system. Okay, so that's what happened. Now, this picture was taken only the second time that this particular airman, whose name was Don Meir, landed in Berlin. The little girl, her name was Joanna Joke. She giving him flowers. I have a picture of the two of them 50 years later, standing next to each other in front of a mural that was at Tempelhof Air Base. That was only his second mission into Berlin. And she grew up, and last we heard, she was living in Vienna, and he was living in California. That's the last correspondence that I've seen anybody have from the gentleman. But the airlift was the first battle of the Cold War. No guns were fired. It was still the world's largest humanitarian rescue. Now they have shipped more goods and more items recently with the events over in the Middle East, but they were using airplanes that could carry 10 times the load of the C-54s. But it wasn't all humanitarian, of course, it was military. But air power made diplomacy work to end the blockade. And it was the diplomacy that taught the United States government that airlift was a diplomatic weapon, as well as a weapon to be used to support our troops in battle. So the government of West Berlin was formed during the airlift. It's a long story about the fights that they had, but the people had to put up with starvation and hardship and cold, and the Russians continued daily disruptions, and the daily disruptions were mostly kidnapping at night. And our American GIs, our military police, shot 27 Russian soldiers during the night in 1947 and 1948 because they were attempting to break into and steal and to rape. And our GIs just didn't put up with that. There were some riots, and the people of Berlin rioted after the Lord Mayor gave a talk about their freedom, asking the world not to give up on Berlin. The people rioted, and they ran, and they formed a big, huge line facing a couple of Russian troops. And the Russian troops, they were ready to shoot, and a British commander walked in front of them and told them not to shoot. But before he could get there, there was a young boy had climbed up on top of the Brandenburg Gate, and he ripped down the Russian flag, and he was shot while he was up there. But the political division between East and West was complete in 1948. The Berlin Airlift saved the city of Berlin. Now, today, the Berlin Airlift, Berlin survives. You're familiar with the wall. You're familiar with the uniting of the capital. I know you are, and I know that you're familiar with everything that the Germans are doing to support the NATO, which was formed less than a month after the Berlin Airlift. So that is basically the story of the Berlin Airlift. There's two fitting pictures. 1945, the big cannonball up on the top, the hole in the Brandenburg Gate, that has been repaired. And the picture there, 2023, the same as it was in 2022. And I want to thank you for your time and for being with me, but freedom is not free, ladies and gentlemen. We lost 32 Americans and 40 British and 9 Germans. Actually, there was more Germans than that died. And there was 4 more Americans died that have not been counted in the results of that. But the Berlin Airlift Gratitude Foundation began in 1952. The Berlin Airlift Gratitude Foundation in 1952 began looking after the widows of the Americans and the British airmen that died during the airlift and supported them financially until they passed. Now, 5 years ago, they changed their purpose, and they are now supporting and giving money to the survivors of the 9/11 events in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania. So if you work in Germany and Berlin now, part of your money is still coming to people to aid Americans, believe it or not. A lot of people don't know that. So General Clay said the top up there was an attempt by the Russians to use starvation as capital for political gain. And if the Berlin airlift had failed, you can read, there would be no NATO, there'd be no Airbus, no euro currency, no tunnel connecting England and France, and there'd be no industrial and commercial conference with the rest of the world. And there'd be no freedom in Western Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for allowing me to give you this presentation. This is the 75th Diamond Jubilee Airlift anniversary, and plans are being made in Germany. They're going to be held in 2 weeks, and we're making plans for Washington next year. And we've got some events planning this year that I've been working on with help from people around the country. So I thank you, and I'll thank you very much. And I'll tell you what General Clay said when he left the city of Berlin. Auf Wiedersehen.
Eddie, that was phenomenal. Phenomenal.
Thank you very much, Eleanor.
That was the most comprehensive discussion of the Berlin Airlift I think I've ever had the pleasure of hearing. So I'm really grateful for this presentation this evening. I know we're running long this evening, but I wanted to have you get through this entire presentation. And I didn't know if anyone did have any questions before we end our program this evening.
Well, see, now I could give you all a candy bar if I knew you when we were there. We give you a Hershey bar.
That's right. You know,
thank you very much.
Oh, that's great. You know, I do have one question.
Okay.
I visited Berlin. I've been there twice. The last was in 2018. And one of the things I did not realize is that all that rubble that you mentioned, that all the women were cleaning up.
Yes, ma'am.
I did not realize there are several rubble piles that are
Yes,
outside of Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, one of those rubble piles is where we had a listening station.
Yes, we had a big radar station up there. And
Yeah,
yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
And I think they called it Teufelsberg.
Yes, ma'am.
But I didn't realize that they were. I had a chance to visit it, and it's like you'd think it was just like a big hill or a mountain, but you
That's
don't
right.
realize it's a rubble pile, which was remarkable to me.
That's what it is. Mm-hmm.
Eleanor, Dan Myers.
Yeah.
I just had a quick comment and a question. I had the pleasure back in, I think, the late 90s, I interviewed Colonel Halverson at Andrews Air Force Base for the then Atlantic Flyer newspaper. Very interesting guy to talk to and interview. And I was wondering, first of all, Eddie, I really enjoyed the presentation. I learned a lot. I was just wondering if you could briefly speak to the road that went in. Did that road exist before the airlift? And was that much improved after the airlift?
I don't know of what road you're speaking of, sir.
Well, there was a road that once the airlift was done, then they could transport stuff from West Germany into Berlin.
They used the Autobahn. Yes, sir. Okay. That was built by Hitler. The Autobahn.
So that road already already existed then?
Oh, yes, sir. That was built by Hitler.
Okay, and so it was just closed during the airlift?
No, sir. Well, the Russians closed it. They claimed it was technical difficulties with the bridges. And so they wouldn't allow any traffic on it. It had been used by the Americans before in 1945, right up until April of 1948. And then the Russians started closing it down and intermittent traffic. And then they closed it down completely. And said it was all technical difficulty, but it was the equivalent of our interstate highway because it had 4 lanes, divided lanes. And that's where they got the idea of the interstate highways. And ironically, General Clay was enlisted in the 50s by President Eisenhower to design the interstate highway system. So General Clay designed the interstate highway system and oversaw its construction.
Okay, wow. So that Autobahn was reopened after the airlift then?
So that was before the airlift. Yes, sir. And it was used afterwards. The first trucks coming into Berlin, they had to use that road, and that's what they did.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. You know, you said the U.S. was primarily delivering coal.
Yes, ma'am.
Is the reason for that is because if I remember in one of the maps you showed early in the presentation, the coal fields were like in the American sector. Was that the reason why they did most of that transport?
Well, they got all the coal from the Ruhr, and that was in the French sector. A good part
Oh,
of it was
okay.
in the French sector. And the French were hard to get along with until it wasn't until June the 25th, I think, is when they threw in their hat and said, "We're with you all the way now." But their government was having conflict. The communists controlled. They had the communists in the French government. They had a large contingent there, and they stonewalled everything that they tried to do in Berlin and in Germany. It was stonewalled by the French government. The day before they threw the airlift, before we began the airlift, they were on the phone for hours over that night. And that's when the French said, "Go ahead, we're with you 100%." So before that, they were giving a hard time with everything.
Right. Any other questions? Nope. All right. Well, Eddie, I'm going to go ahead and end this because, again, I know we're running long and you were generous. No, you were very generous with your time this evening. So very much appreciate it. And I want to thank you again for this. It was a terrific presentation. Very grateful for it. And grateful Don decided to cede the floor to for you this evening. So
thank you, everybody.
So thank you. So please join us, everyone, on July 13th for our next presentation. But thanks again for sticking with us this evening. I'm sure you were just as pleased as I was with this topic. So, Eddie, thanks again.
All right. Thank you, Eleanor.
All right. Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.